Welcome to this launch of RTI's 2 new how-to guides on assessment-informed instruction. My name is Alice Cornish and I'm a director at Better Purpose, and I'm very pleased to be hosting today's webinar for you on behalf of RTI International. Now, this session is all about acquainting you with these 2 how-to guides so that you know what's in them and how you can use them in your work. So I first want to draw your attention to the 2 QR codes in the corner of your screen. We've gone very high tech here. So if you open your camera on your phone and hold it up to the code, you should see, you should be directed to each of the 2 guides which are hosted on the Science of Teaching website. You also should have received a link to the Science of Teaching website and the guides in the email that I sent to you yesterday. So one of the guides is on assessment-informed instruction at the classroom level, and one is focused on assessment-informed instruction at the system level. So you hold up your camera, scan the QR code, and it will take you straight there. And you'll find on the Science of Teaching platform a whole host of resources relating to the Science of Teaching foundational literacy and numeracy, including a set of 8 guides on structured pedagogy, which were released earlier this year. And of course, if you want to do things the old-fashioned way, the links to the guides will also be posted to the chat box for you to click into. So you can see Kate Noble has just posted those guides. If you can filter through to them through the introductions, you can also access them there. And please do click on them. Please do open them, save them to your favorites, add them to your bedtime reading list, share them with your colleagues, your friends, families, pets, whoever you want, share them on social media. We really want these guides to be useful and in the hands of those that will get the most out of them. So please do share far and wide, and we hope that you'll be more encouraged to do that after this session today. So with that in mind, let me give you a quick overview of what you can expect from today's session. So we'll be starting with some opening remarks from Dr. Benjamin Piper, the Principal Investigator of the Science of Teaching grant at RTI, and also hearing from Dr. Asia Kazmi from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have funded this work. Following this, we'll be hearing from 2 of the guide's authors, Melissa Chapek and Wendy Rangita, who will be taking us on a tour through the guides to better acquaint us with what they cover and some of their key insights. We then have the privilege to share just a few short remarks from Dr. Alphonse Sebaganwa, the head of the Department for Basic Education and TVET examination at the National Examination and School Inspection Authority in Rwanda, who will be sharing a few thoughts as a policymaker before we move into our next session. And then for our main discussion, we are delighted to have joining us Dr. Dear Jingwen from the Language and Learning Foundation and Margaret Kamau from Education Development Trust in Kenya, who will be joining Ben in conversation about their work on assessment-informed instruction in India and in Kenya and their reflections on the guides. So without further ado, I'm pleased to hand over to Dr. Benjamin Piper, Senior Director for Africa Education at RTI and Principal Investigator for the Science of Teaching grant, to kick us off and explain a little bit more about why we're all here today.
Thanks so much, Alice, and welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see the names of old friends and new friends on the chat. First of all, happy International Literacy Day. We are going to talk about something that's really critical for improving literacy, but not just literacy, also numeracy. So as Alice said, I'm the Senior Director, Africa Education for RTI, and most importantly for today, the Principal Investigator for the Science of Teaching grant supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we are talking today about assessment-informed instruction. My shorthand for this is using how kids are doing in school and classrooms to inform what the system does, what the teachers do, and how they should teach. So how they're actually doing, informing the system and the teacher. The first thought is to be driven by the work of, from India, from Karthik Muralidharan and others who are thinking about the mismatch between the skills of the kids and the instructional quality. You can imagine like the teacher focused here and the kids are down here. And so fundamentally, we're missing so much learning because there's a mismatch between the target and the kids. And that's affected both by the system as well as by the teacher. Therefore, it's essential to improve foundational literacy and numeracy outcomes. It's essential to get teachers to teach kids, not just content. But what we're going to talk today about is how. It's also essential in order to improve outcomes to get the larger education system to know how children are doing in order to help them be able to respond. But how? So that's our task today, to talk about how. The push on assessment-informed instruction is important. But by the way, anyone can say that it's important, and many have before us and before this day. And our task today was to review the empirical evidence and the great literature and all the great work from many partners who are on this call that suggest how you do these things. How do you do it? We should do large-scale assessment. We should use that assessment to support countries to make changes and respond to results. We should also help teachers to do classroom assessment and to use that to improve instruction. But how? I want to talk about kind of two central dilemmas, two problematic people in this push to have assessment-informed instruction. The first is me. As a graduate student, I was actually in Ethiopia helping the Ethiopian National Organization of Examinations to implement the second national learning assessment. I was excited about working on the quality of the tools, to work on psychometric properties, to support comparisons over time. But do you know what I didn't spend a single moment on as the problematic person when it comes to assessment-informed instruction? Ensuring that the data was used, linking the results to actual decision makers, either the national, regional, or local levels, connecting the items to the larger choices the government was making, to think about healthy accountability. It was just a technical exercise. That's the first problematic person. The second problematic person is me also. In my first year of teaching, I distinctly remember being a classroom teacher sent to a professional development session on assessment in the classroom and feeling from the first day that the ideas were completely unrealistic. They gave me a big assessment booklet. I set it aside. They trained me on how to do running records. Actually, I had a great professor who taught how to do running records, kind of continuous assessment in the classroom, reading with each kid, a notebook. We wrote down the learning outcomes, the fluency rate of every child every week. You do some on Monday, some on Tuesday. It didn't happen. So how do we make sure that the assessment, the classroom methods that we ask teachers, well-meaning like I was, but a little bit lazy, but making sure that those tasks aren't too complicated, too painful, or just too much extra work. So many recent attempts at continuous assessment for teachers are seen by those teachers as completely unrealistic and have never happened in the classroom, no matter how beautifully people like us wrote them down. In fact, you'll see in one of the guides, there's a kind of a text boxes from teacher D, who's kind of an indication of the practical response of teachers like me back then to these overly complex ideas. We're going to wrap up with this. There have been many previous attempts to do assessment-informed instruction, but they remained in the domain of donor projects, unconnected to the broader government structures, and critically to decision-making. Any previous attempts for teachers have made this topic a bad word, a curse word to teachers, given all the additional work required. So the question for today is not whether it's important, but how do we do it? The guides you're going to look at today are drawn from evidence and experience across dozens of low and middle income countries, various authors, and many different teams. It's actually a love letter to our colleagues in the sector. You'll see a lot of your work, you'll cite it, a lot of your examples pointed out, to the partner organizations who are dealing with this complex issue, and appreciation of the great ideas in the sector. It's a modest effort to help us to move to the how. We've tried to write these in a different style to be readable by our real target audience, which are these policymakers, implementers on the ground, and donors in countries. And it's part of a broader effort, Science of Teaching, which is a task to create simpler documents targeting these decision makers that have included, as Alice said, structured pedagogy, assessment, and then hopefully soon we'll be able to release some new guides on key issues of language of instruction, pre-service, and our beloved numeracy. So look out for those. The theme of all those is the same as how do we learn from those of you who are working on cracking these key dilemmas to help improve foundational literacy and numeracy at scale. So I'm really excited about today, and really it means a lot that you've come today, and we look forward to the discussions about how do we do this important task. Thanks, Alice. Back to you.
Thanks, Ben, and happy International Literacy Day. I mean, what a wonderful day to be having this gathering and having so many people talking about this important issue. I'd now like to invite Dr. Assia Kazmi, who's the Senior Education Policy Lead at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to share a few words of introduction on behalf of the Foundation. Assia.
Thanks a lot, Alice, and I'm not sure how I can top Ben's quote of "It's a love letter to our colleagues in the sector." I've got 4 points to make, and the first one is how we think about teaching, and we have books written on it, journals on it, but essentially teaching at whatever level is, where are my students now, which is about the assessment. Where do I want them to be? And often the curriculum, the lesson objective, the goal is directing that. And then how will I get them there? And this is where the instruction and the magic happens. And assessment-informed instruction connects these 3 things. So it's great to be continuing the conversation on pedagogy under the Science of Teaching grant and getting technical about what effective pedagogy looks like, and the important point about how do we have it happening at scale. So my experience in education has been as a teacher for more than a decade, an inspector, policymaker, and a funder. And what when we look out for effective programs or effective teachers or schools, the essential component is always about formative assessment or assessment for learning, all of these phrases capturing that assessment-informed instruction. And then important thing, the third thing about formative assessment and assessment-informed instruction is that it's forward-looking, it's action-oriented, and it's based, it's a key question of what are we going to do based on the data that we have about the current state. It is an intrinsic component of effective teaching and learning at all levels, from the classroom to the school, the district, and national. And this is why I think the guides being at the classroom level and the system level interconnected is really, really important. So we really look forward to understanding how you're engaging with the guides, your feedback on it, your application on it, and what needs to be done further. My final point is a quote that I want to share with you. And the quote is, "The teacher must adapt their teaching to the pupil's capacity and ability." This is a quote by Ghazali, and he was writing 1,000 years ago. So assessment-informed instruction isn't new, and the focus now is about how do we embed it into practice so that it's parlance, the common parlance for teachers' work, and we make it easy for them. And at the system level, that information is guiding resources and support for teachers. My thanks to the speakers and to all the work that's gone to this, and I really look forward to hearing more from those who've been practitioners and are using this and supporting teachers to embed effective practices for instruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assia, and for the Foundation's incredible leadership and support of this work. A few housekeeping points then before we dig into the guides, which is I know what you're all waiting for. Firstly, we're all being recorded today, as you can see, and the recording will be available for those who weren't able to join us in today's session. Secondly, there are 3 ways that you can engage in today's discussion that we want to encourage. So the first is that if you want to ask a question of a speaker, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And here you can ask a question, and we will endeavour to either respond through the speaker presentations, time permitting, or through providing a written response. So if you have a question for a speaker or a very specific question about the guides from one of the speakers, please feel free to use that. Secondly, if you'd like to add a comment or a reflection on what's being said, or a contribution about the guides, perhaps, please do use the chat function to do this, which I can see is already a really active space for people introducing one another. And please note that the chat is for your reflections, your thoughts, your contributions, not for questions. So do direct your questions through the Q&A function. Finally, we have set up a virtual notepad. And we've set this up through a platform called Padlet, which some of you may be familiar with and some of you may not be familiar with. There's a link that is coming through the chat now to the Padlet, and some more eagle-eyed attendees have also spotted that the QR code will take you to Padlet. So if you follow that link, what you'll find is a link to an online, a virtual notepad, which has, of course, some links to the guides again, but it also has some stimulus questions for you. So questions like, what more about assessment-informed instruction do we need to know? How can we make the guides more relevant, easy to access, user-friendly? What other topics relating to the teaching of foundational literacy and numeracy should we develop guides for? And then also some questions about your reflections on some of the challenges and what's working to address those challenges in terms of implementing assessment-informed instruction. You don't need an account to add. You can simply click on this little plus sign and you'll get given an option to add a comment, post a comment. You can give it a topic. You can even add links to documents or photos or whatever you think is most relevant and useful. So we are very, very keen to give you the opportunity after this webinar has ended, once you've had time to sit with the guides, to comment on them and really engage with them. So please do use that Padlet if you're able to. And the link to that was also in the email that I sent out yesterday, and we'll send it again after this session. Brilliant. Okay, so without further delay, let's explore the guides then. And to help us do that, I'm very pleased to welcome Melissa Chiappetta and Dr. Wendy Rallengita. So what I'm going to do is just take us back to the Prezi, where we're going to do a bit of an interactive walkthrough for you. Before I do that, I just wanted to introduce our authors who will be presenting. So Melissa is a monitoring and evaluation expert and is currently working on a contract to advance global measurement of reading and maths outcomes for primary and secondary grade learners. She's also served as a senior research and learning advisor for USAID's reading and literacy team, and as a technical team manager for more than 40 performance and impact evaluations. And she has played a leading role in the systems level how-to guide on assessment-informed instruction. We'll then hear from Wendy, who will be talking us through the classroom level guide. And she's a senior education advisor at RTI International, a specialist in curriculum and instruction with over 25 years of experience in teaching, training, and teacher education, and 15 years of experience in education program management. She provides technical leadership and support for literacy and numeracy programs, and most recently served as the senior reading advisor on the Nepal early grade reading program, and previously on the Ethiopia Read TA program. Melissa, let me pass over to you first to talk through the system level guide for us today.
Great, thank you, Alice. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's exciting to be here and to have the opportunity to be launching the guides. It was a really great experience to work on the assessment guide, given that assessment is something I'm so passionate about and really believe has so much value and potential value to make a difference in education systems when used well. I think, assessments allow us to understand what students have learned and where their gaps are, and also to target resources to the schools and students and teachers most in need, but only if they're used, right? And only if they're done well. And from our research, we found that only 17 of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have recently completed high quality, large-scale learning assessments for foundational literacy and numeracy. So that's really the purpose of the guide, is to help policymakers, donors, and implementing partners to better understand how to build strong assessment systems and to ensure that those assessments are used. We kick off the guide with sort of a description of that, and then following that, you'll see that we move into analysis of the current assessment system, understanding the levels of assessment, the costs of assessments, and then finally, we end with a section on improving systems level assessment. So to move to analysis of the current assessment system, As I said, this is the first major section after the introduction. And here the idea is really just to make sure that when thinking about adapting an assessment system or creating a new assessment system, that the first step is really to figure out what's already in place. So not only what is legislated in policy and law, but also what's actually happening on the ground. And so in order to do that, we want to make sure to look at what assessments currently exists at the different levels. Is there an international assessment, a national assessment, a subnational assessment, and what about school and classroom level assessments? And then also to examine what actually informs teacher behavior right now. Are they using those assessments? And if they aren't, what is informing their behavior in the classroom and driving their teaching practices and pedagogy? The next section, we talk about understanding the levels of assessment. And here we really lay out the different levels of assessment that I mentioned, and you can see them all here in the box on the right. So international and regional assessments, national assessments, subnational community assessments, and school and classroom level assessments. When we talk about assessment in the system, as Ben mentioned, we're really talking about measurement of teaching and learning outcomes across different levels of the education system. And when we talk about systems level assessment, which is what this guide is about, we're really talking about assessments that seek to evaluate the effectiveness of the education system. So largely the large scale learning assessments, such as international and regional, national, subnational, and community-based assessments. Next, we move on to talking about the costs of assessment and considering the various trade-offs when determining what type of assessment system to build or how to adapt the assessment system. It's really critical to think about the costs, and we wanted to make sure that oftentimes when we're building assessment systems or helping to adapt assessment systems, there isn't always a thought about how we will sustain those systems in the end. And just as Ben was saying earlier, I'm also guilty of this, right? Of creating an assessment system and trying to get information for a project and really trying to build the best system that we can, but not necessarily thinking about how can that be sustained after the project ends. And this is really what we wanted to focus on in the guide. So we wanted to talk about the comprehensiveness of the assessments, the size of the sample. So when do you need a large sample, or when might you be okay with something like lot quality assurance sampling, where you're just taking a few students from schools rather than a representative sample across the whole spectrum. And then also the complexity of the information required. How much information, how many different items do we need? How much additional information do we need outside of the assessment? And how can we build inexpensive and rapid dashboards that users can access quickly and easily? Then really the meat of the guide is in the last section, which is on improving systems level assessment. And here we talk about 8 different tips for how to improve systems level assessment. The first is around embedding assessment into the education system. So this really means legislating and putting in policy the implementation of the assessment, who will actually conduct the assessment, who will use the assessment, and how will the assessment be funded over time. So really making sure that it's embedded within the system as opposed to being a parallel system. The second key tip is to be realistic about the cost and sustainability. And I mentioned this already a bit earlier, but really we don't want to build assessments that can't be maintained. The third key tip is ensuring alignment of assessment within the education system. So you can see here in figure 6, we have a graphic that shows the various levels of alignment that should be considered between content standards, performance standards, assessments across the system, benchmarks, targets, teacher instruction, materials, etc. We want to make sure that all of these components are in alignment. And we discuss a great tool called the Surveys of Enacted Curriculum, which is not the only tool, of course, that's out there, but is a great one to be able to look at alignment across the system and examine where there might be misalignment within the system. The fourth key is to clarify the purpose of the assessments. And here we really want to make sure that we're setting expectations for learning outcomes as one possible purpose, but the other possible purposes are monitoring and holding schools accountable for meeting expectations and intervening to support students in schools that are struggling and to ensure equity within the system. So in that section, we talk about, based on that purpose, what keys you might want to consider in order to make sure that the system is well set up for those particular uses. The fifth key is to focus assessments on what teachers and policymakers need to know. So here we talk about measuring important skills. For instance, higher order skills, complex skills, critical thinking and comprehension being some of the skills. If those are key outcomes that we expect of students, we want to make sure that they're included within the assessments. Also ensuring the validity of the tools and that they're appropriately leveled for the grade and ability of the students. And then finally, around the extra instruments that we might want to implement: classroom observations, teacher interviews, student interviews. A lot of this information, I think, is really invaluable in understanding the hows and whys behind the outcomes that we find when we conduct assessments. And without that knowledge of the hows and whys, it becomes really impossible to be able to target effective solutions to those challenges and gaps that we see. The sixth key is to decide when and how often to collect assessment data. So we're talking about the different levels of assessment and how often those different types of assessments might need to be conducted. So you might want to see assessments that are going to be used for monitoring results for particular students or particular teachers. You might want those types of assessments to be occurring more than once in a year so that you can identify where the gaps are and help to address those gaps specifically for those teachers and students. If you want to monitor the assessment as a whole, the assessment system as a whole, you can take a bit more time, a year or so. And then the large scale assessments, international assessments, can be 4 to 5 years. The seventh key is around finding balance between accountability and learning, and recognizing that high stakes assessments often lead to teaching to the test leakage, and asking poor performing students to stay home. So we've talked about how it's helpful not to rank schools, and also how it's important to disseminate results at the school level and use those results, have coaches use those results, for instance, to be able to coach teachers. And then the final tip here is around ensuring targeted dissemination. And there is a box there on the bottom right where you can see an example of a targeted dissemination for a teacher. So teachers really need to know how students have performed on individual items, what the correct response was, and how many students actually got the correct response, what the reason was for their error, and then a recommendation on how they might address that gap in their students' abilities. And then we also go through all of the other types of stakeholders that we might want to focus on to be able to target results to them. So that's just a really quick overview. We're excited to dive more into this and hear your questions, I think, in a bit after we hear from Wendy on the classroom-based systems tool.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. And just a reminder to do post your Q&As in the Q&A function. I think we've had a few already. If we can't answer them in the presentations themselves, what we'll do is we'll make sure that Melissa and Wendy have an opportunity to answer them with written responses afterwards. So we're really welcoming of questions. Wendy, over to you.
Thank you, Alice. Hello to everyone who's joined us from around the world. And thank you, Melissa, for laying out a clear overview of what is in the assessment-informed instruction guide at the systems level. I'm now going to take us down to the classroom level and look at assessment-informed instruction at the classroom level for literacy and numeracy, and similarly take us on a walkthrough of the guide, what we can find in there. So we start with a section looking at what is assessment-informed instruction. And here, similar to what Melissa talked about for the systems, when we talk about the classroom, we think of assessment-informed instruction as activities undertaken by teachers, sometimes students, head teachers, and coaches that can really follow where the students are, track their progress in order to make decisions about teaching and learning activities, which could be modifying instruction, could be targeting support to students who are struggling. And in this section, we really unpack a lot of terms and types of assessment-informed instruction, of different kinds of assessments. So for example, in figure 1, we unpack formative assessment, summative assessment, assessment for, of, and as learning. We talk about, give examples of what they are, how they work together, to give a picture of the different kinds of assessments that are we want to see taking place at the classroom level. And I'll note that in the guide, we focus primarily on formative assessment and assessment for learning. These are often overlooked in many contexts and also very, very key to good instruction. Then in this section, we also talk about some of the common challenges low and middle income countries. For example, teachers knowing what to assess and when, creating the time needed for assessment and remediation, recording and tracking assessment results. These two things can in particular be daunting when you have a large class or are low resourced, to figure out how to find the time and how to record the results. And then using the results. This can also be challenging, especially for teachers who may be new to assessment-informed instruction, to know, okay, once I do my assessment, what exactly am I going to do with that information? How am I going to use that to help students? So having laid out an idea of what is involved with assessment-informed instruction, we then move on to the second part, which is how do teachers assess for learning? What can assessment for learning look like in the classroom? And so ideally, we want to see teachers asking these questions to guide their assessment. Why am I assessing? What am I assessing? What methods of assessment should I use for those purposes? And then what am I going to do with the information once I carry out the assessment? And so in this section, we really look at how can teachers figure out how to answer those questions. We have a lot of illustrative examples. So table 3, which you can't really see here, but you can go and look at the guide and see it very, very clearly there. But we lay out a number of different concrete examples of different types of assessment for different purposes, and walk through some of the ways in which the teachers might use that information. And we also purposely tried to have different sort of levels of assessment, some that were more easy to carry out, some that are more difficult. At the same time, we have to remember that teachers will vary in their ability to utilize those questions to apply assessment-informed instruction. There can't be a one-size-fits-all because teachers may be at very different places in carrying out assessment for learning, assessment-informed instruction. And in the guide, we propose a kind of way of thinking about where teachers might be in terms of tiers, from maybe perhaps a basic level and kind of a novice level where a teacher may be just starting to really trying to incorporate formative assessment into the classroom, maybe walking around as students are working to see how they're doing, up through a much more advanced approach where a teacher may be familiar and comfortable with a number of different assessment techniques and is able to make decisions about which types of assessments are appropriate at which time for her students. And in order, when we're thinking about supporting teachers to be able to do assessment-informed instruction, we need to be thinking about where they're starting. So for example, Ben shared an example where perhaps the support wasn't in line with where that particular teacher was in terms of assessment-informed instruction, and he ended up not using it. And so whatever support is given for assessment really has to match where the teachers are. Having talked about where the teachers are and the fact that support needs to target where they're starting from, takes us into the last part of the guide, which looks at how teachers can be supported in assessing for learning at scale. And this especially comes back to some of the challenges that we mentioned early on, thinking about how realizing and acknowledging these challenges, how can teachers be helped in those contexts with those challenges? And so the first step in terms of trying to support teachers is to really understand the context well. Some of this relates to what Melissa has shared, looking at the alignment of the system, because what's happening in other parts of the system is going to affect what teachers can do in the classroom. Also understanding what are the particular challenges in that context. We laid out some common challenges, but what challenges you actually find in a particular context can help to determine what kind of support the teachers may need, and getting a sense of where the teachers are. Which tiers are most of the teachers found, starting from where they are in terms of support. And then we talk about different ways that teachers can be supported, particularly through curriculum and materials, and then teacher professional development. When we look at curriculum and materials, there are a number of different ways in which materials, particularly teachers' guides, can provide scaffolding for teachers to improve, maybe to begin to tackle or improve upon existing assessment-informed instruction approaches. So for example, in figure 4, this is just one illustrative example that we share from Funda Wande materials that really provides teachers with some good instructions on how to carry out an assessment that targets phonics, and as well as when to use it, and ultimately later on what to do with the results. And in that section, we discuss different ways that this and other teachers' guides scaffolds for teachers and helps them to address the challenges. It gives tips on how to record, perhaps giving tips on how to use results. So we walk through a lot of that in that section, and then moving on to teacher professional development, considering all of the elements of teacher professional development, pre-service, in-service, and ongoing teacher support. This really builds on the structural pedagogy guides that you will find on the Science of Teaching website. And so in this case, building on those other guides, we really focus on what can be done in particular for supporting assessment-informed instruction. And so we have this little figure is Teacher D's monthly coach visit. We just give an idea, kind of illustrate how this one teacher may be supported through coaching visits to develop her skills in assessment-informed instruction. And when you read the guide, you'll sort of follow Teacher D's path as she becomes more aware of assessment-informed instruction and improves her skills in that area. So tracing how we want to see the growth of teachers as they become more adept in assessment-informed instruction. So that gives a picture overall of the guide and the structure of the guide, as well as some of the information we're trying to share there. And overall, this and the systems guide together is really geared to looking at how to help systems and teachers be able to effectively monitor student progress and change instruction or provide targeted support to help students master those basic literacy and numeracy skills. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Wendy and Melissa. We have time for a couple of questions, and I can see that the Q&A is very much getting going now, and some of those questions have already been answered. I mean, one question that I wanted to start with actually for Melissa, I'm going to use my host privileges, if I may, and get this one in there, is around kind of the consensus that there was around these guides. So in the process of developing these guides, how easy was it to come to consensus, Melissa? And were there any areas where it was particularly challenging when thinking about the systems guide specifically?
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, that's a great question. I think in a lot of ways that the writers agreed on many of the things that were included in the guides, and there is a lot of literature about the key tips that are in there. I think some of the areas where we discussed and went back and forth, the one that I can think that comes to mind most initially is whether or not to have enumerators come from the government. So does it ever make sense to have government officials or decentralized officials actually collecting the data for the assessment in the field, or really should it be somebody outside of the government? And we kind of went back and forth on that. It's been done different ways in different countries. And of course, we want to make sure that results are not biased in any way. But we also wanted to think of how we can ensure that assessments will be sustained. And so what are the ways to really reduce those costs?
Great, thanks, Melissa. Wendy, there are a few questions coming through that are around a sort of similar theme. So some of the tips that you might have for assessment-informed instruction when thinking about classes that are very large. And I guess a sort of related theme that is cropping up in the questions is around catering to, within very large classrooms, children with very specific needs, or potentially children who have had very challenging experiences, such as those that live in fragile contexts, and how to cater best to them. So I wondered if you had any sort of tips or reflections that might address some of those different questions coming through the chat.
That's a hard question to answer just with a simple answer. A couple things that I'll mention that one of the things that I didn't mention when I was talking about the tiers is, I think you can think of the tiers both in terms of the teacher's capacity and skill, but also can relate to the context that they're in. So some of the assessments that that we talk about in the guide may seem very elaborate for a particular context where you may have 100 children in the class or something like that. In terms of actual, I don't want to get too much in terms of like specific things, because that's not entirely the intent of the guide. I mean, things like rotating, first of all, just moving around the classroom is something that I think is very overlooked. Well, we call it a novice task. I think it's something that's often overlooked, just moving around the class while the students are working and seeing how they're doing and maybe taking some notes. You can also do rotating assessments where you work with certain children at given times. I will say that one of the really important things about thinking of these guides together is the alignment in the system, and issues like how is the teacher going to have time to remediate when they have large class sizes and have students at different levels. I think that to some degree, the teacher, him or herself, can only go to a certain length in terms of solving those problems. I think some of those problems have to come with looking at the alignment in the system, and what way is the system allowing for mechanisms for things like remediation to take place. It can't all be just on the teacher to figure all that out.
Great, thank you, Wendy. I don't think we'll have further time to address some of those questions live, but I know that Melissa and Wendy will be around for a little bit longer to respond to the questions through the Q&A. So do keep checking, and I'm sure your question will be answered. So thank you so much, Wendy. Thank you, Melissa, and congratulations on these guides. So for the next session, we really wanted to bring in the voice of policymakers. When we think about implementing assessment-informed instruction, this isn't a conversation that we can have without bringing in that policymaker voice. And so we're really pleased to have Dr. Alphonse Sebaganwa share a few thoughts with us before we move into our longer discussions about the guide. Dr. Sebaganwa is head of the Department for Basic Education and TVET examination at the National Examination and School Inspection Authority in Rwanda. In addition, he's the coordinator of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, ADEA's Inter-Country Quality Node on Teaching and Learning. And he's also the national coordinator of the Network of African Learning Assessments and the National Focal Point for SDG 4. Unfortunately, Dr. Sebaganwa wasn't able to join us in person as he's in the midst of Rwanda's assessment season, but he has generously recorded a few comments on his context in Rwanda, some of the things that he's focused on when it comes to assessment-informed instruction, some of his challenges and his key takeaways from the guides. So let's hear from Dr. Alphonse.
We are organizing a very structured training for those teachers, a guide to assessment. We developed a guide to assessment. We developed assessment standards. We develop even model questions for all subjects and all grades. They are all accessible online. But even if they are accessible online, those teachers are not, most of them are not able to work themselves and to understand really and to use those materials. But we are planning to organize what we call CPDs. Those are I think this is known. Continuous professional development for teachers when they have different modules and they have each every week they do have 2 to 3 hours free, 2 to 3 free hours to work on these CPDs, to meet together and try to discuss on a module, like for example assessment standards, because this is cross-cutting from grade levels. The other problem is the turnover of teachers. We have a high number of turnover by year. Those who leave the teaching profession for other profession, that one, and the others that moved from a level to the other level. But those new, they have to be trained again, CPTs or other kind of training. Those are really some challenges that we face from the national level to the implementation in the classroom up down there. There is a very huge gap, and it takes really time to implement practices, best practices or policies. We have very good policies, very good document, even uploaded in the website. But from the website to the end user, there also it is really somehow a problem. So those are some challenges that from my side we are facing in the education system in general, but in assessment in particular. So that it raises the accountability of teachers on this concept of assessment. It raises really the accountability, and I saw that it is structured well, the assessment space from the classroom to other levels. So this guide, when if it is really used and disseminated, can be an important tool that can transform the assessment system in the schools.
We're really grateful to Dr. Sebagama for sharing those thoughts, and we really look forward to discussing the guides with him in more detail in the future. So for our next session, we really want to hear from the people who are actually implementing assessment-informed instruction in their everyday work and get their perspectives on the guides. So I'm really excited to hear from them, and to introduce our speakers, I'd like to pass back to Dr. Piper, who will be joining them in discussion about the guides.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks so much for the great introductions to the guides from Wendy and Melissa. I reflect on our colleague from Rwanda's comment about the very huge gap between some of the ideas that have been implemented in the past in continuous assessment and the practicality of what that looks like for a rural teacher. I see a bunch of questions on the chat about in the Q&A around classrooms with 80 kids, classrooms with 150 kids, and what is the practical way we can support them to use these sorts of methods. And that's one of the things we'd love to get into with actual implementers who have experience with this sort of thing. And very excited to hear from two colleagues along with me. We're going to walk through their experience on assessment-informed instruction. We're going to hear from Dr. Dir Jingran. I'm so excited you're here. He's the founder and director of LLF, which is the Language and Learning Foundation, which has conceptualized and implemented early literacy and multilingual education programs for over 2 decades. He's not brand new to this. There's a lot of do's and don'ts that he's learned. So we look forward to hearing from that. Dir's worked in policy positions within the government in India and advised several ministries of education across South Asia. He's on the advisory boards of several national and international organizations, including UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. He speaks regularly at international conferences on primary education and literacy, and we're glad you're here, Dir. And in addition, we have Margaret Kamau, who's a trained teacher, which is a meaningful thing here in Kenya. And she's currently the Deputy Project Director for Education Development Trust's Girl Education Challenge project in Kenya, where she provides technical leadership for the project and oversees quality control. Her expertise is particularly in education program design and management, with a focus on both girls' empowerment and those in adolescence. Her passion is to see young people's lives transformed through high quality and evidence-based education program strategies, and keen to test new and modified approaches to program delivery. She holds a master's degree in education and international development from the University College London Institute of Education. So welcome to Dir and Margaret. We're going to have a set of questions that I'm going to ask you. The first one, I'm going to give Margaret the chance to speak first, and then Dir. Margaret, I hope you're up here and you can see you. Great, I see you now. Okay, so here's the first question, and this will go first to Margaret and then to Dir. So first question is this. We've talked a lot about this idea of assessment-informed instruction, and you're actually implementing programs to improve learning outcomes. So what is your current biggest bet on assessment-informed instruction in your program? What do you think is critical that you're doing? Why is it so important? And why did you decide to focus on that in your work? So first, Margaret, and then Dir. Welcome.
All right. I think from the ground, the first thing we discover is just the reality of the gap between our intentions and outcomes. So we have a curriculum going on, we have school inspection going on, we have NGOs and all kinds of help coming into the schools. But when you go to the assessment and checking the performance of the learners, there is a huge gap. And part of why I appreciate this manual is it begins sensitizing us and can be a very good instrument for sensitizing systems, schools, all the way to even the students on what results could be expected, and then what strategies can we use to help us get those results. So like in what we do in our organization, it's a longitudinal study, and we are assessed actually by the improvement benchmarks. So we need to know what is the baseline. Then we need to be informed, and perhaps that's what this whole manual then could help us also think through. How do we get the technical expertise in having instructions that are both reflecting on the gaps that have been identified by the assessment, but that also help the learners progress as the curriculum could be intended. Part of what we do is we have work going on at the school level, but we also have learning that takes place at the community level. And we're saying wherever this learning is taking place, and depending on even the context, because we have even learners either with disabilities, learners were in catch-up centers. So all these are different contexts of learning taking place in school and out of school. And it is very important to have benchmarks to know what targets we are expecting, and then to help the learners move from where they are to where they should be. So it is very important to have assessment-informed instructions, very key.
Thanks, Margaret. Might follow up on some of those points later on, but let's go to Dear now. Dear?
Right.
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everyone. Our work is at scale, so we work with state governments to improve foundational learning. We are highly focused on what we say equitable learning, that all children should achieve mastery over FLN skills. And within that, we have a special focus on improving the learning of children at the bottom of the learning pyramid. So the bottom 25%. In fact, the success of our demonstration programs, we define as improvement in the learning, significant improvement in the learning of children at this level. And that is where assessment-informed instruction becomes really crucial for us. It is helping us to guide three crucial strategies that are a part of our instructional design. The first, frequent revision, sort of reteaching and practice by children. The second is differentiated instruction where there's a multi-level class. So how do you then teach what's appropriate? And the third, of course, is remedial work for struggling learners. So what we do is that we've got assessments, which the guide calls summative, and rightly so, but we use them for an entirely formative purpose. So a weekly assessment, which is done every Friday in most states. And in that, that is an assessment which then determines 1 day of remedial work every Saturday. The second kind of assessments that are helping us use these three strategies that I defined is a periodic assessment, 3 to 4 times a year. And based on what emerges from there by the teacher, this is done in a very simple manner by using cutoff or threshold scores. And the teacher then decides if there should be a kind of whole class revision, because the children seem to have not learned or forgotten. And within that whole class revision, again, our focus is on kids who are not doing well. So the guidance is that during this revision time, also the teacher would spend 70% of her time with children who are doing better. 30% with them and 70% with kids who are struggling. And the last kind of assessment that we do is at the beginning of school after a long break, again, with an intention of ensuring that there is remedial and sort of revision work. So that's the kind of model that we have, and assessments are an absolutely crucial part of how decisions are made in the classroom for revision work, differentiated work, and remedial work.
Thanks, Dear. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to you. Let me get a little background, though. So what you're talking about is kind of a system for teachers to implement their normal lessons plus this assessment and then some possibilities of whole class revision or targeted instruction. One of the things we're actually really interested in right now is countries and programs that are doing catch-up programs. So teaching at the right level approaches. We actually have really great support from the TARL Africa team and the Pratham team actually here in Kenya. We look forward to being able to roll out a catch-up program here. But one of the things we're really concerned about based on earlier opportunities to do this kind of approach is teachers resisting this as feeling like too much work. So it goes to some of the questions that came earlier about kind of large class sizes. Dear, how in your experience do we create that right level of assessment-informed instruction expectations so that teachers do it, but that it's also helpful? Like, how do you find that balance between complexity and willingness to implement? What's your experience?
Right. We've been guided by an experience we had in our country in the last 10 years, where assessment for learning or formative assessment actually became a bad word, because of the excessive record keeping that teachers were supposed to maintain. And also, there wasn't enough training in different contexts, as you were saying. How do you do it in a large classroom? How do you make it? So that's been a challenge for us. So what we've focused on is documentation. Record keeping is not important. What's important is to be able to, assess children every week. Now here, of course, in a large class, not every child gets assessed every week. It it's alternate weeks or once in 3 weeks. And the important part here is this, that this supportive instruction, or what we call remedial work with children, happens during the subject time allotted for that subject. For example, let's say language. So it's not that the teacher is expected to do any extra time. 20 to 25 minutes in grades 2 and 3, where the differences start to emerge, is allocated for supporting children who have been identified earlier through a weekly test or a periodic assessment, to spend extra time with those children. And it's true that the other children will be doing some self-learning, kind of self-driven work, which is reading and writing. We have been questioned, what are you doing about kids who are doing well, in the sense that you're sort of kind of neglecting them. We know that it's difficult for a teacher to work with 2 or 3 groups together. So what we've said, focus on children who are struggling, definitely provide good activities and tasks for the others. But if you cannot manage both groups, keep an exclusive focus on children who are struggling. So trying to take care of the burden of sort of record keeping and assessment, and also where the demand is to work with 2 or 3 groups parallelly, that becomes difficult for teachers.
Just to reflect on that, there are a couple of programs that I've been involved with where we actually see that this idea of continuous assessment and assessment-informed instruction we're quite excited about. It feels like a burden. You have these long worksheets that they have to fill out and they really hate it. So this idea, one thing to take away from your comment is this idea of record keeping is actually not important, to move away from the bureaucratic push on assessment-informed instruction to the instructional push. Okay, so can I ask Margaret first, what did you find in the guides that you were already doing? What was there that you found like were tasks that you already were implementing in your work at EDT?
One was the discussion on teacher using the assessment results and integrating that in the coaching process. So we have an elaborate coaching process. So that we have a coach who's normally either a super teacher from the school or one who's a roving teacher, has been seconded to us by the Teacher Service Commission, and they're coming to support the teachers in both classroom observation, but also in assessment. So they're able to give the teacher a professional feedback on both their assessment strategies, but also the results and how those results are informing. The other thing we have also been doing is teacher coaching, so communities of practice, a subject panel sitting together and catalyzed again by the coach, as well as the subject head. So the whole idea of enabling the schools utilize the results. The other thing we are doing was the whole mention of SEGRA, EGMA, and SEGMA. We think it is helping unpack where the gaps are. And every time we present that to the stakeholders, whether the Ministry of Education officials, quality assurance, they finally get to appreciate where are the gaps. Who is affected in what way? Therefore, which team needs what support? And for them, it's always a new revelation. You mean this is happening? But also our ability, like what you have indicated in the manuals, of disaggregating the grades. So of the kids who are failing, what are other parameters that could be attributing to this? So for example, in our project, we discovered children who are coming from parents who are illiterate tend to perform poorer compared to the other. So that ability to disaggregate the information also then helps inform who to target. It can be a targeting and feedbacking session for parents. It can be homestead visits, because we also do homestead visits. So it helps us to do that. The other thing we've been able to do is what was also indicated in the EGMA, the whole idea of moderation of the tests. So we have different learners, we have special needs learners. So when you administer the test as is, it sometimes would give us some erroneous indications because it doesn't have the moderations, for example, like the way our government would do it during the national examinations. So those are some of the things that we are noticing. And I think there was also the whole issue of accountability.
So Margaret, can I ask you one follow-up question, and then we'll move on. You mentioned this idea of having the assessment results being done by the coach, either the super teacher or the roving teacher. One of the things I've seen, and I think are in the guides, is like, what's the magic number of students that they should assess to be a valid kind of discussion back to the teacher, but isn't overwhelming? We've kind of navigated that. I know many other partner organizations on the call have tried to figure out how to balance it so that it's enough to make a useful conversation, but not too much that it takes forever. I've observed it taking forever. What's your view in your work here in Kenya?
I know there are people who do maybe 3 students, sometimes to
Yeah.
just triangulate. If you can get at least 5% or so, I think that would be good. But what I realized, they also do a strategic observation. So sometimes they're a part of the class and are making quick deductions as they observe the teacher and sit with the groups as they're told, do this. They're able to make a quick deduction. Where are the children? And therefore they're able to come up with a feedback, not necessarily by giving a test after the lesson. So they integrate it as part of their classroom observation.
Great, thanks, Margaret, very helpful. I think that's a real important challenge. I know some of us are thinking about assessment informed instruction from the teacher point of view, but also from this coach, figuring out the right balance is important. Okay, I want to hear from Dear on the things you think we're missing in the guides. We've talked about this and communicated about it. There's some things that you think are good or were there that you're already doing, and some things that are a gap. Can you comment on either side of it, the things that you're already doing that were in the guide, or things that are missing that are important?
I think two things that we have learned from it, and we definitely want to adopt, adapt, and implement. The first is we found the kind of assessment techniques, illustrative assessment techniques for formative assessment during teaching and learning to be a very simple way of presenting to a teacher about how this can be done on a regular basis. We do that, but it's somehow, I think, we haven't used a variety of practices. So I think that was good. And then, of course, since there is assessment happening so frequently, it is the time for assessment is there, but more importantly, to be analyzing those assessments very simply, to put children in ranges and different scores. The Tangerine Teach example that was there was very useful. And I think we have been thinking, but now to be able to at least ensure that assessment records are entered and simply analyzed to be able to decide what. So the two things that I think we'll definitely follow up on from the classroom guide. What's missing? Again, I think it's a very particular context of India. In India, apart from the kind of national and subnational assessments that are mentioned in the systems guide, one other kind of large-scale assessment is prevalent in several states, and that is a kind of centralized census assessment that is to be done in every school 2 to 3 times a year. And the objective of that assessment, there's a centralized set of questions that comes from a central location. The teachers administer it, of course. And then this is transmitted upwards again for data entry and analysis. The challenge here is this, that it serves no formative purpose because it often doesn't get analyzed, as was mentioned earlier, or it's not useful for the school at the school level. That's a big challenge. Findings are often not shared with the school also. And then it becomes high stakes very soon because teachers realize that it's going up to the state level. They probably don't know that no one knows what to do with the data, but the fact that the system is collecting this kind of data, and that's when sort of fudging of the data starts. It's happened in several states, and so slowly you'll see the scores improving, over time to show to the administrators, or in some places, scores are all clustered around the average, B or C level, so that no one can come to a classroom and say, there's a problem here. So I think it's important, at least for us in India, we are talking about this because it consumes a huge time and energy of the academic system as well as administrators. And it takes away the emphasis from formative classroom-based assessments. So we've been saying, if it's diagnostic, let's have clarity of purpose. If you want to do a diagnostic test to understand what are the problems that children are facing, then do a sample diagnostic. If it is to understand a trend, again, a sample over each year can do. A census assessment is best done with children by the teacher, with guidance from whatever systems you have. But this is a big challenge for us in India. Thank you.
So, dear, just to respond on that, Stephen Blunden, who's working in Rwanda, made a comment about the kind of the local EGRA assessment. It sounds quite similar to what you've described. I just wonder, and maybe Stephen, you could make a comment in the chat to be part of this conversation too. Is it actually possible to do this kind of census level assessment that, dear, you've laid out, and Stephen, you've explained, that doesn't become high stakes? I really worry that just the process of bureaucracies makes it inevitable that it'd be high stakes, and that maybe, to reflect on what you said a moment ago, dear, is that it is actually distracting from kind of what Wendy laid out as far as assessment informed instruction. Stephen, I see you there, so maybe you can comment in the chat what you think about whether it's possible and what the likelihood is in Rwanda. And dear, from your point of view, is there a different method that could make it actually not, so bureaucratic, or is it just hopeless?
I see Steve is saying that, yeah, right. So I agree with this. The system view, it seems to be from a governance and accountability purpose. The way it's been defined by educational administrators is that we are collecting data of every child. It also is like a power. I've got what every child is doing, a little realizing that that's not what actually children are learning in school. But it's from the perspective of saying which schools are not doing well, which are doing better. Even that, the data is so huge that it doesn't get analyzed in time and fed back into the system. So just clarity of purpose, I think census assessments to look at what children are doing, what should be done for different children, is best left at the classroom and school level. And in terms of health of the system, we've got achievement surveys that happen every 2 years in the country, 1 year, 2 years. That tells us about the health of the system. Smaller diagnostic studies can tell us, where the problems are in literacy and numeracy. So there's really no reason, but it seems to be going on because administrators think it's a good way of their understanding the system, but it doesn't help the teacher or the school or the children in any way.
That's great. And I see Stephen's comment too, that Dr. Alfon's view is that this should be a teacher-focused process. We'd really like to learn, Stephen, from the Rwandan case over time, if that actually is able to be sustained over time. And thanks, dear, for your comments on this. I want to go to Margaret. We were on the topic of what's missing in the guides from your experience that you think is really important, that you've learned about assessment-informed instruction that didn't show up in the guides. Any comments on that?
A few. One
Please.
is a discussion that came up about teacher behavior and instructional choices. And I just thought, how do we make this an intrinsic drive? So perhaps they've been trained. Let's use that as the assumption on assessment. Good inspection is going on. Head teacher is doing their job. But there are malpractices. Some of the malpractices we have in Kenya include buying commercial test papers and dumped on the children and have no relation whatsoever with the learning that is taking place. So how do we, I have no way, I know they like the word incentivize and gets into money discussion. I have no interest in that area, but how do we make it an intrinsic drive? That's one for me. The other one is mainly the skill of assessment is assumed. And perhaps that's why they're buying commercial papers. So what recommendations would we give on skilling the teachers? Actually, when I looked at your document, which I have here, where you're able to band the teachers from most basic to a proficient teacher in terms of assessing for learning, very good, up until you meet the trade union, who will be very up at arms saying, our teachers are well trained, please do not interfere with them. And yet we know they will have their own gaps. So how do we navigate that political space so that eventually we can have teachers banded by their skills of instruction, assessment, development, then target how to upskill them and do a good follow-up on that. For me, that was interesting. The third one was, how do we unmask assessment at community level? COVID gave us a very interesting opportunity to question our abilities to have communities actually understand assessment. So for example, for our project, what we did, we were able to develop tutorials. Against the tutorials would have clear instructions, good example, and assessment questions that they would do and get follow-up at community level by mentors and educated persons, teacher volunteers on the ground. So we realized that, for example, like what I said, when you have parents who are illiterate, it doesn't matter whether it's an A or a Z, they have no clue what's the difference. So how do we unmask assessment skills at community level so that both they're able to develop outside of a classroom context, but also make interpretation and therefore support at that level? For me, that was interesting, but also the fourth one, which I thought I could mention, was a mention again on children, the learners. How can we bring up their engagement more in terms of, is it developing of assessment items, making sense of the results? Usually they tend to be the recipients. So they have no idea what are these discussions we are having of poorly developed assessment tools, or all that is, they are not the only recipients. So how do we bring up their engagement a little more? I know it has been indicated, but I think it needs to be pulled out a little stronger so that their role in assessment is clearer. Everything from peer support, how can they peer support? Can they develop assessment? And of course, from a teacher perspective, this is, I'm treading on wrong water. Can a child set an assessment item? Who moderates that? But is that a skill perhaps that they can improve on? So yeah, those are some of my reflections. But a fantastic manual. I think we have many things well broken down. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. I think there was a really rich discussion. You hit on the community level role in assessment, the teachers unions, once you put them in these bands or tiers, how they respond. And I wonder if this idea of the assessment skill of the teacher is linked to their incentives to change. I feel like sometimes teachers get such a bad rap that they're unwilling to change, as opposed to us as program implementers, donors, policymakers, haven't designed the assessment informed instruction process in a way that is simple enough for them to have success with, and then to see outcomes change for their kids. I would really love for those of you on the chat who have experience with getting teachers to do more of these sorts of behaviors in the classroom. What is the way we can get them to do that? That is not, as you said, per diem, allowances, and there you talked about kind of how do you make it so that they're embedded that 20 to 25 minutes in the classroom. To me, that's a really critical question. We wrote these two guides and we talked about it, but kind of unpacking from this group what you think is the right level of complexity on the teacher behavior and instructional choice process, so that teachers are most likely to implement these new methods. That really seems to me something we need to have more of across experiences. So if you have any comments on that, please do share in the chat. So we're wrapping up our panel. I want to give Dear first a chance to comment on kind of anything else you think is really important for us to know about assessment informed instruction from your experience, that we think that, as your parting shot, something really important for us to hear from you. Dear.
So I think many teachers are willing to, adopt these practices. Sometimes it hasn't been explained to them well, how it can be a part of teaching learning. Still, assessment is seen as an end in itself. So I think just clarifying and to be able to communicate that, and using professional development as an ongoing continuous process. Typically in India, there's a one-shot training program that happens annually, but to be able to send these messages through regular visits by coaches, review meetings that might happen, messages and ideas on WhatsApp, for example. Some of the strategies in that guide could be sent to teachers, once a week, pick up one and say, are you doing this? So ensuring that professional development is an ongoing process, that's very important. And the last point I'll say is about the system. The inspecting staff, educational administrators, let's say, they're very influential with teachers. So when they go to a school, they should be asking the right questions. What happens typically is that an inspector goes to a classroom and starts with, who's the president of India? He's not bothered about which grade, what is happening. He's got one set of, so basically also this cadre, it's the entire ecosystem. You can't target only the teacher, the coaches and the administrators were very influential to really understand what children should be knowing at that point in time. And therefore, teachers also will start to sort of work on that once they see administrators are understanding what's to be done. Thank you.
So dear, I like how you're putting kind of the instructional change process from kind of obviously initial training, but a lot of follow-up and support from the people who they respond to. And keep in mind that's different in Indian states from countries in sub-Saharan Africa elsewhere. Who are the people who are influential with those teachers, and can they reinforce these issues around changing pedagogical practices to use more assessment-informed instruction? And can this be followed up with some technological support, messages, WhatsApp, etc.? Thanks, dear. That's great. Margaret, any big last comments? I see some really good ideas in the chat from Erie about the importance of this science of behavior change. It's critical. We talk about this in some of our other guides on structured pedagogy. I think it's essential here in assessment-informed instruction. So, Margaret, your last big point on this topic you'd like us to know.
I think what I enjoyed the most in the manual was the concept of assessment as learning, and having a whole emphasis on formative assessment. I think that should continue being an emphasis, because that will be one of the key ways of having instructional changes based on assessment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Margaret. That's great. I have so many other questions, but I'm conscious of time, and there's so many questions in the Q&A. I want to bring it back to Alice to guide us on what we talk about next. Alice, thanks so much. But before we go, really appreciate Dear and Margaret thinking on your feet with these questions, and let's please keep the chat going on the topics that are coming up. Thanks for sharing your experiences, Dear and Margaret. Back to you, Alice.
Thank you, and thanks to you both, Margaret and Dear. And I wonder whether actually we might keep you for a moment more. As Ben says, there's been lots of fantastic questions coming through the chat. And so I wanted to slightly break from our agenda and wonder if I might bring back all of our speakers, Wendy and Melissa, to join with Margaret and Dear and Ben, because there are a few that I would just love to pull out from the Q&A and see sort of who might feel best placed to respond. Actually, the first question I have is from Joe, and it very much draws on something that Margaret was just talking about, this idea of assessment for learning. And his question was around the distinctions between assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And that strikes him as a good, simple way to help teachers understand different ways to use assessment as part of their pedagogy. And he asked what has been the experience of some of the panelists and speakers today in helping teachers to see those distinctions. So, I mean, maybe that would be a good one to start with the RTI team and Wendy, but it may be that Dear and Margaret want to comment from their perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Dear and Margaret have to say. One of the things, I think, yes, it's a useful way to think about assessments. I just would not want to get caught up in the categorization of having the training time spent like, well, this is really assessment for learning and this is really assessment as learning, as opposed to just thinking the teachers being able to think about the purpose in their own way. But the modeling, the practice, and then the reflection on practice is, I think, really key. So I want to spend, my attention more on that than on trying to differentiate. But talking about it could be a helpful way to guide reflection. So I just, sort of a balance, I guess.
Thanks. And Dear, any thoughts from your experience?
Just a simple thing. What we say is assessment of learning for learning. It is an assessment of learning, but completely for improving learning. A weekly test or end of the unit. The sole purpose is to ensure that learning can improve. So while it is not an ongoing process, but it is for learning in a way. So that's, without using this, we actually say everything is for improving learning.
Thanks, dear. And I don't know if we've got Margaret still, but perhaps we'll move on to the next question. So we had another question from Carl, who was asking about this sort of tension between the Ministry of Education's requirements for teachers to follow the syllabus and the emphasis on learners learning. So he raises the point that assessments take place, but do not always influence teaching. And how can we move away from that narrow focus on following the syllabus and prioritize the learning of learners, especially, you know, in different sort of systems where maybe there are capacity challenges in the public sector? Who would feel best placed to comment on that one? Melissa, I wondered if I might come to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the key question, right? Which is why maybe we all hesitated a bit. But the actual behavior change is so difficult because we don't always know what informs teacher behavior currently, right? So that's one of the reasons why we recommend identifying early on and conducting an assessment of what is informing teacher behavior now. And once we understand that, then maybe there's some incentives that we can build around that information to inform behavior change in the future. But that's so much easier said than done. And I think, you know, it's really going to vary between different countries on the ground. One thing I have done also, Alice, is just to examine cases where we see that some teachers are changing their practices and their behavior, and to identify those as sort of positive deviants and dig into why have they changed their behavior and what led them to actually decide that this was worthwhile. And sometimes there are lessons that can be taken from that to apply to other trainings for other teachers. But love to hear if anybody else has any other great tips.
I'm gonna jump in on that and just say I'd like to sort of flip it around. So looking at, there are things that you can look at what's happening with the teacher, but I think the looking at the alignment in the system and what are the messages that the teachers are getting from the system. For example, if there's a large scale assessment at the end of the year or any end of the year assessment, and teachers are getting messages, are being given messages that that's what's important, is where you are at the end of the year on that assessment, and that drives what teachers are going to do. Or messages that the teachers are giving from inspectors, from, you know, central level officials, that what is important is covering the textbook. That where are you when I come in to inspect? What lesson are you on? Are you on the right lesson? Like all those things are going to impact. You know, so I mean that does, you know, come back to what's happening in the context, but I don't think we should jump to looking at the teacher as the problem in terms of why aren't they doing the right thing.
Alice, could I say a word?
Please do.
Thanks. Just a quick one. I see some conversation around this idea of, I have two comments actually, I hope it's okay. One is around this idea of tiering teachers. Just to be clear, the purpose of tiering teachers is so that we as program implementers, policymakers, donors, etc., don't jump all the way to the sorts of tasks that only a very sophisticated, experienced teacher would do. And then say that anything below that, like ticket out the door or thumbs up, thumbs down, which are very light level assessment informed instruction activities, aren't useful. I think if a takeaway from this panel is that we go back to our programs and think about the lightest touch assessment informed instruction activity that would hit the teachers at the bottom end of the distribution of tiers, that's a useful takeaway. It is not for us to go to a country and say, okay, you teachers are in this tier, you teachers in that tier, but it is important to say, let's not have these continuous assessment activities be so complicated that only the top 10% of the most well-trained and critically highly motivated teachers are willing to implement. Small differences, walking around the classroom, doing a little thumbs up, thumbs down, simple activities like that can make a significant difference. And that's really important. And that's why we had the tiers in there. The other comment I'd make is just about this issue of how do you get the system to utilize data. There are a few countries that have started to do these kind of dashboards for learning that are targeting data at different levels of the system. So the Ghana team actually has done this. Our program in Kenya has done this, where you have kind of a dashboard that is using student assessment data and critically classroom instructional data to kind of have the high-level policymakers understand which parts of the country are implementing the program and doing that well, but also kind of having mid-level civil servants not just understand whether their teachers are implementing, understand whether or not these coaches that both Margaret and Dear and Melissa have talked about as being really critical to program implementation, understanding whether or not their officers are doing their job. I think the power of this kind of assessment data, not only to say, okay, we're learning or we're not learning, but critically, our officers are implementing or not, and then they can really utilize that data to get their teams to move and to assign their staff to go to different parts of the country, et cetera. I think it's really been a useful tool for government. And in the Kenyan case, they've seen the power of it and are applying it to different cadres of education officers, as well as different levels of the system. That sort of approach is something that's worked well in a few countries. Thanks.
Thanks,
Maybe,
Margaret.
I can jump in. I think there's a question behind all this sometimes is, who is a good teacher? Show me a good teacher. So in my thinking, perhaps we should also have organized reflection meetings, whether in school or inter-school. But I'm also not hearing the place of ICT supported mentorship and coaching. Because in a smaller forum, like in the clusters, they're able to demonstrate good practice. A school could invite the other to see good practice. But how do we make this nationally? How do we make this internationally? How do we maximize on ICT for that good sharing? Perhaps we need to maximize on that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Alice, may I take 30 seconds?
Please do, Dear.
Okay. So I think syllabus is a big issue, and the definition, in fact, in some states in India, even term-wise, they say in the first 3 months, this must be covered in the next 3 months, not just the whole year. But I think the textbook is the biggest tyranny for early grades, because that, in a way, in the hands of a teacher, becomes the only resource, and the teacher sort of then goes to, cover it from the beginning to the end. Our struggle has been to say that especially for language, the textbook is just provides you, some good texts which children can use for reading, and therefore it's important to advocate for, materials like simple reading books or primers, and take away what the textbook has, because the textbook and often assessment actually follows the textbook. So again, that's the system issue, that the assessments, especially the assessments that come from a higher level beyond the school, are all sort of content focused, because they ask questions from individual lessons of the book, and that forces the teacher to actually teach the textbook actually. So a lot of these things can change, and we've managed to change in some places, but it is a challenge.
Thanks, Dear. And the last question that I wanted to take from the Q&A and sort of introduce to this group was, it really touches on the idea of the usage of these guides, and actually it sort of refers to textbooks in particular. And it's a question from Eri, and he asked the RTI team whether they see the teacher guides and these tools being a substitute for existing textbooks. And one of their insights about teacher guide creation is that you need to sort of build around the textbooks or provide an alternative. And so I think there's a question in there about the kind of, who are these for, and how might they kind of complement some of the tools that teachers have access to, and some of the tools and resources that teachers are using on a regular basis. So that's probably for the RTI team.
I was waiting for Wendy, who's a real expert, to say something.
I was waiting for you. Okay, well, I guess I can jump in. I mean, we've seen a range of possibilities for using the textbook, not using the textbook. I mean, so much of it depends on the context, because, well, I would say, I tend to like, and many of my colleagues tend to like, the idea of a very supportive teacher's guide that can really help the teacher, which could complement existing textbooks, or it could be linked to a new core learning material. But then you run into the problems in some contexts where you are told or discover that teachers, because they've never had a teacher's guide, it's really a big change for them to start using the teacher's guide. And so you may, at the same time, you may be, one of the things is in the training, getting them to have their hands on the teacher's guide and use the teacher's guide during training. But then still sometimes you're also pushed to try to have all that in the textbook, because the teachers always just revert back to the textbook. So it's a really complicated question to answer. I don't think it necessarily has to be always replacing the textbook. But I also don't think there's a real easy answer, because so much of it has to do with what teachers are used to and how to start there and build from what they're already doing and already used to. I don't know if I answered that at all.
No, Wendy, just to completely agree with you, I think the only comment I'd make in addition is that if you have the opportunity to have a teacher's guide linked to a textbook, which is, at least from my own personal point of view, country dependent, is an ideal situation, you can have in the teacher's guide actual suggestions on these continuous assessment informed instruction activities embedded in the guide to remind, to go to, the comment from others about kind of reinforcing this issue, reinforcing this idea of going back to assessing learning and embedding that in daily practice. I think textbooks, as a side point, I think textbooks are critical to having learning outcomes improve, just how you manage them as far as, the assessment informed instruction opportunity. Thanks.
Sorry, I must just say that I didn't mean that we should do away with textbooks. It's a question of the interim, when the textbook is, as we said, a complete disconnect between what children know and what the textbook is hoping to do. You need an alternative set of materials while we work towards supporting governments to develop high quality textbooks, because we do know that in countries like ours, the textbook will always be the main resource. But right now, using the textbooks that exist is problematic. So we advocate for selective use of the textbook. A lesson that the textbook says is meant for children's reading is actually far beyond their reading abilities. We advocate for that to be used as a read aloud for children, and interact with children on that, because it's completely not possible for children to read. So the textbook definitely is there, and we don't disregard it completely.
Thanks so much, dear, and to all of you, and to Melissa and Wendy for stepping back in, to dear Margaret and Ben for all of their insights. I think we're really got a taster there of just how much rich discussion there is to have around these guides, which hopefully will continue on in the Padlet. So we have a few minutes left. What I'd like to do in that time is to actually capture from you some thoughts about how collectively we can take this work forward. And of course, also capture your feedback on the usefulness of this event as a way to disseminate the guides. And so we have a short evaluation form for you to complete. The link is coming into the chat. There's also a QR code that you can capture to take you to the link to the evaluation form. I'm introducing you to the evaluation form when we still have a few more minutes to go. The session is not over. Do not log out. We really, really want to take the time to get your feedback. So I'm going to play some music for a moment, which you can all enjoy. And that hopefully will give you a moment to access the form while we're all together. I know it's a really busy time of year. And so we did want to carve out a few moments for you to access the evaluation form and share your thoughts with us. So if you'll humor me and listen to some music for a moment while you access the evaluation form, I would really appreciate it. may or may not have given you quite enough time. So if you didn't have time, please do complete the form in your own time after the webinar. But thank you for doing that, and hopefully you enjoyed the music as well. Two more things from me. One is a reminder to use that Padlet again to capture your feedback on the guides. The link's just gone into the chat. The QR code to access it is there. The comments that we've had, the vibrancy of discussion in the Q&A and in the chat today has told me that we're only just scratching the surface of the expertise in this group. So please do share further thoughts through the Padlet. The link's in the chat, and it was also in the email that I sent out yesterday. So thank you in advance for sharing your thoughts on the Padlet. I'd also like to draw your attention to an exciting live opportunity which may be of interest to lots of you on this call. So 100 and the Jacobs Foundation are looking to identify 10 to 15 impactful and scalable education innovations that promote the use of formative assessment to inform teaching and learning. And they're looking for innovations of all sizes and across all borders to ensure that assessments work for everyone. You can go to 100.org to learn more, and we'll also post the link to the specific webpage in the chat. You know, we really wanted to support our friends at 100 and Jacobs Foundation and share that opportunity with you all on the call today. I think that's enough from me, other than to thank all of our wonderful speakers today, and to all of you attending and in advance for using and sharing these guides. And of course, a big thank you to the team at RTI and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for leading this work. For a few closing remarks, I'm going to pass back to Dr. Benjamin Piper, who's going to close us out for today. Ben.
Thanks so much, Alice, and to the speakers and to the Gates Foundation for funding this. We're really really happy with the engagement, and I don't want to talk long, just to say two comments. Number one, I'm really struck by Dr. Alfonso's comment about the huge gap between the reality of what happens on the ground and our ideas at these levels on webinars. And so I'm hopeful that you can take away an idea or a strategy that you can use to reduce that gap on assessment-informed instruction, either at the system level to make these assessments used better, or at the classroom level to help the teachers you're supporting to embed these practices in actual ways in their classrooms. And then the last comment is just to remind you that this work really is a love letter to the colleagues. You'll see so many of your activities or research there, and I'm really excited about being able to have this document of the work that the sector is doing on this topic shared more broadly. Thanks to the authors who spent a lot of time on this, and thanks to the broader education sector who really gave a lot of feedback to make these useful. And we look forward to discussing more of these sorts of things in the future. We have additional documents like this for other topics that we should be able to share out with the broader community soon. And thanks for the time today. And let's look forward to reducing that very large gap that Dr. Alphonse mentioned. Thank you so much.